Fort 4. Fort Jefferson, Dry Tortugas. The Dry Tortugas is a cluster of 7 coral islands and sandbars that continues westward from Key West near the southernmost tip of Florida into the Gulf of Mexico. Bush, East, Garden, Hospital, Loggerhead, Long, and Middle Keys, as well as the incomplete Fort Jefferson on Garden Key, were designated as Fort Jefferson National Monument in 1935 and Dry Tortugas National Park in 1992. The park, which is part of the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary, covers 101 square miles of land and ocean. The islands were discovered in 1513 by the Spanish adventurer Juan Ponce de León and named for the tortoises that lived there. In 1825, a lighthouse was built on Garden Key and another in 1856 on the biggest key, Loggerhead. Fort Jefferson is the world's biggest all-masonry fortress. During the American Civil War, it remained in Union hands and was used as a jail until 1873. Among those imprisoned was Samuel A. Mudd, the doctor convicted of complicity in President Abraham Lincoln's assassination because he set John Wilkes Booth's broken leg. The park is only accessible by boat or aircraft. Its seas are rich with marine life, including 3 kinds of sea turtles. Thousands of migratory birds pause on the islands to rest or nest. A huge flock of sooty terns nests on Bush Key every spring and summer. Fort 3. Monel Sea Forts. During World War II in 1941, the British Admiralty and War Office decided that London and Merseyside required stronger anti-aircraft defenses. Amphibious forts were recommended as a remedy, and Guy A. Monel, a notable civil engineer hired by the government, created 2 unique designs. According to Monel's plans, the Navy would have 4 forts in the North Sea off the coast of Essex, and the Army would have 6 forts, with 3 in the Thames Estuary and 3 in Liverpool Bay. During World War II, the Thames Estuary sea forts were acknowledged for shooting down 22 enemy planes, sinking 1 E-boat, severely damaging another, and destroying 20 to 30 V-1 flying bombs. There were also several rescue missions carried out from the forts for pilots forced to ditch and land in the North Sea. These consisted of a boat-shaped reinforced concrete pontoon covered by a steel deck containing weapons and radar systems. The forts were mostly prefabricated and assembled in a specially modified dry dock basin at Gravesend by Holloway Brothers Limited. The 2 Navy fort towers each had 7 levels containing fuel, ammunition, water, and living quarters for the crew. The main deck had accommodations for the officers, and the Bofors deck housed fresh and seawater tanks, ventilation systems, and the main gun defenses. The control room had a landline connection to a shore-based HQ and was equipped with telephones, radios, and early radar technology. Each tower had a dolphin, which was a lattice steel docking platform equipped with a crane for loading supplies. When each fort had been commissioned and outfitted, it was pulled by tugboats to its final resting place with a full crew aboard. Once in place, the hollow legs were progressively filled with seawater until they sank to the bottom in less than half an hour. There were 4 Navy forts in the Thames Estuary. Sunkhead, Trinity House briefly explored acquiring this fort to serve as a lighthouse to mark the outer end of the Sunkhead Sands in the Barrow Channel, but there were fears that any settling of the fort on the seabed, making it list, would disrupt the lights, so the plan was ultimately rejected. Between October 1965 and April 1966, Tower Radio Tower used Sunkhead Fort. But when the funding for the project ran out, they abandoned Sunkhead, leaving behind a brand new generator and all of the broadcast equipment. Sunkhead, unlike some of the other forts, was well outside territorial seas, and when the Marine Etc. Broadcasting Offenses Act went into force in August 1967, the government was keen on ensuring that it didn't become a target. On August 18, 1967, the Sunkhead was boarded by a force of the 24th Field Squadron of Royal Engineers from Maidstone aboard the tug Collie, led by Major David Ives. Acetylene cutting torches were used to undermine the fort, and 3,200 pounds of explosives were detonated. 3 days later, the fort was blown up, leaving only 20 feet of leg stumps. Ruffs. On August 11, 1965, Jack Moore and his daughter Jane entered Ruffs Fort under the guise of implementing a project to renovate it to a fun palace and health complex, which was most likely a cover story for using the fort in some way more directly tied to Radio Caroline's operation. The upper residence of the fort was cut away during their tenure to make room for a helicopter landing pad. The fort was subsequently left unattended for a short period until being claimed by Roy Bates, proprietor of Radio Essex BBMS, in December 1966, shortly after his station closed. A fight ensued over the occupancy of Ruffs. While it was momentarily neglected by Bates, a boarding party from Radio Caroline retook the fort, only to be violently evacuated by Roy Bates and his crew. Once the Marine Etc. Broadcasting Offenses Act went into force, Radio Caroline intended to utilize Ruffs as a supply base, or perhaps to replace the Mi Amigo as a broadcasting base. On June 27, 1967, Radio Caroline deployed a squad of raiders from Harwich to the tender Offshore 2 to rescue Roy Bates from Ruff's tower. As one man attempted to board, petrol bombs and missiles were fired at him, leaving him hanging from the ladder as the Offshore 2 moved away. The individual was eventually rescued by a lifeboat, and despite police intervention, no charges were ever filed. Tongue Sands. Tongue Sands Fort had settled significantly badly when it was grounded, making it unstable. The fort rocked strongly on December 5, 1947, and sections began to tumble into the sea. HMS Uplifter rescued the caretaker crew after they sent a distress call. Divers eventually confirmed that the foundations were sound, but during a subsequent storm, the fort developed a 15-degree list, and the 4 surviving men had to be rescued by the Margate lifeboat. The Tongue Sands were eventually abandoned in 1949 after the pontoon broke its back, flooding the lowest levels of the fort. Due to its fragile condition, Trinity House briefly investigated Tongue Sands for use as a lighthouse, but due to its fragile condition, a lightship was anchored nearby until the mid-1980s. By the mid-1960s, when Radio Essex considered using Tongue Sands as a transmitting station for the projected Radio Kent, underscouring had further damaged the fort, massive holes had emerged in the east leg, seawater had inundated the lower levels, and the platform had become separated with huge gaps between the deck. The Radio Essex team saved all of the fort's priceless wire and metal. The Tongue Sands Fort ultimately crumbled into the underscoring pit during storms on the 21st and 22nd of February 1996, leaving only a single 18-foot stump of the south leg visible above sea level. Knockjohn. Radio City intended to utilize the Knockjohn Fort as the location for a new radio station. In mid-1965, they dispatched a small team to Knockjohn with a transmitter, a tiny generator, and numerous pieces of transmitting equipment. However, Roy Bates had intentions of utilizing the fort as a headquarters for his radio station, Radio Essex, and the Radio City team was removed from the fort in late 1965. From October 27, 1965 to December 25, 1966, Radio Essex BBMS transmitted from Knockjohn Fort. Fort number 2. No Man's Land. No Man's Land Fort was established to protect the coast from attack. It was then sold as a private island and transformed into a luxury hotel, and was the home of odd economic maneuvers that resulted in a property developer stealing the only set of keys and barricading himself within the island's stronghold. No Man's Land, one of 4 forts erected in the Solent Straits to protect the shipyards at Portsmouth, exemplifies the bizarre fates of Palmerston's Follies. A set of enormous fortifications built in Victorian times to safeguard the coast against anticipated French invasion threats. The Palmerston forts, which included No Man's Land, Spitbank Fort, St. Helens Fort, and Horsesand Fort, were the most expensive and comprehensive fortifications ever built in peacetime. Perhaps they functioned as a deterrent because the French army never invaded. No Man's Land was built over nearly 20 years for a hefty sum of $476,293. The cannon-laden armored artificial island, about 200 feet broad, was designed to house 80 men and 49 cannons. Originally, the submerged core of the circular fort offered shelter from the weather as well as a freshwater supply from a well drilled into the seabed. In World War I, it operated as a defense post against submarine assault, and in World War II contained anti-aircraft weapons, despite the fact that it never saw combat against the French. The fort was decommissioned in the 1950s and was sold by the military in 1963. It was converted into a luxury hotel in the 1990s, complete with 2 helipads, 21 guest rooms, a roof garden, and restaurants. The lower center was glassed in as an atrium for the heated pool. Regrettably, the isolated hotel never took off, and in 2004, developer Harmish Pooney purchased it for over $6 million with the aim of renting it out for special events, such as Wicked Henchmen's meetings or apocalyptic device planning sessions. Unfortunately for Pooney's goals, the tainted water in the hotel pool sparked a Legionnaire's disease outbreak, and his business suffered as a result. Although there were reports that Duran Duran's Simon Le Bon was considering buying it as a hideaway, it was placed up for sale in 2007 for nearly $4 million, but was not purchased. Faced with financial difficulties and the prospect of losing the island to creditors or new investors, Harmish Pooney did the only thing he could think of. He packed his belongings, took the keys, and barricaded himself inside the fortress. When he was interviewed in 2008, images of the property indicated a significant drop in standards: dead plants, filthy furnishings, and a half-empty pool filled with murky brown water. In early 2009, Mr. Pooney was eventually expelled. Most recently, No Man's Land was sold to Swanmore Estates Limited, a Gibraltar-based company, for the bargain price of $937,139. It is unknown what their plans are for the fortress, but they have renewed an application to create a floating breakwater and port, as well as another helipad. Fort 1. Bull and Hale Sand Forts. When World War I broke out in 1914, the fear of German naval activity in the North Sea, both from U-boats and the Grand Fleet, prompted a series of defenses along the east coast. The Humber estuary was designated as a secure mustering point for convoys, and as a result, a variety of defenses were constructed to control the entrance. Along with the installation of 2 batteries on either side of Spurn Point, 2 forts were built in the estuary itself, Hale Sand Fort and Bull Sand Fort. Bull Sand Fort is the largest of the 2, built to control the main passage into the Humber estuary. The fort was built on top of a submerged sandbank using 2 concentric steel rings driven into the ground and thousands of tons of chalk and debris deposited to make a sturdy foundation. The fort itself is a 4-level circular steel-framed concrete reinforced building. On its seaward side, 12-inch 30-centimeter armor was installed to withstand gunfire from powerful naval forces. It was equipped with 4 6-inch Mk7 guns as well as 4 searchlights. It could house 200 troops and had fresh water pumped into storage tanks from a natural stream beneath the sea floor. Because of the fort's intricacy, it wasn't actually finished until December 1919, over a year after the First World War ended. Bull Sand Fort was abandoned throughout the interwar period, but was manned by the East Riding Heavy Artillery Regiment in 1939. The threat of rapid motor attack boats had escalated by this time, so the fort's weaponry was upgraded to add 2 6-pounder quick-firing guns. Hale Sand Fort was completed in late 1917 and was situated on a hexagonal concrete foundation on a sandbank 1,640 feet off the coast of Lincolnshire. It was a 4-story circular concrete fort coated with mild steel armor. The construction was further strengthened by additional steel supports inside the fort. The structure was topped with a 2-story central battery observation tower that was initially mounted with 2 4-inch quick-firing guns. The fort, like Bull Sand, was manned by the East Riding Heavy Artillery Regiment from 1939 until 1945, when it was armed with 2 12-pounder guns. In 1941, these were reduced to 2 6-pounders. Both forts were decommissioned in 1956. The Hale Sand Fort was sold at an auction for $119,219 in 2018.
There have been many brave people throughout history who've risked everything they have for something bigger and greater than themselves. These people are our heroes. They come in many different forms: male, female, short and tall. Historical wars have generated diamonds in the rough in the form of liberation fighters who've long outperformed their abilities. War has a variety of outcomes, and soldiers give their all to ensure victory for their country. Soldiers are never limited by factors like gender, age, or physical fragility when it comes to patriotism and matters of national respect. And many go through extremely challenging physical and mental transformations to become the person they're needed to be at their pivotal moment in time. 4. Freddy and Truce Overstegen. Freddy Overstegen joined the Dutch resistance during World War II when she was only 14 years old and quickly became one of its armed assassins. Freddy's sister Truce was by her side, as well as a young lady named Hannie Schaft, and the 3 of them ambushed, lured, and killed German Nazis and their Dutch collaborators. Freddy and Truce had a single working-class mother who raised them in the city of Haarlem. Their mother was a self-proclaimed communist, which resulted in her teaching her daughters the same, preaching the importance of fighting social injustice. She took Jewish refugees into her home after Europe hit the brink of war in 1939. The Nazis then invaded the Netherlands in May 1940, beginning an occupation that would last until the end of the war. In response, the girls teamed up with their mother to distribute anti-Nazi newspapers and pamphlets for the resistance. We also glued warnings across German posters in the street, calling on men to work in Germany. Freddy later recalled in interviews with anthropologist Ellis Jonker, which were published in the book Under Fire: Women and World War II. And then we'd hurry off on our bikes. Such actions were not only subversive but also very dangerous. If the Nazis or Dutch police had caught the sisters in the act, they could have killed them. However, because they were both young girls, officials were less likely to suspect them. This could have been one of the reasons why a commander with the Haarlem resistance group came to their house in 1941 to ask their mother if he could recruit Freddy and Truce. Their mother accepted, and the sisters agreed to join. Only later did he tell us what we'd actually have to do: sabotage bridges and railway lines, Truce told Jonker. And learn to shoot Nazis, she continued. I remember my sister saying, "Well, that's something I've never done before." In one case, Truce lured an SS officer into the woods to his death. As their recruiter had stated, the girls learned how to use guns and soon started to go on assassination missions on their own. Later, they concentrated on assassinating Dutch collaborators who arrested or threatened Jewish refugees and resistance members. Freddy was particularly good at pursuing a target or keeping a watchful eye during missions because she appeared so young and innocent. Both sisters used lethal force, but they never disclosed the number of Nazis and Dutch collaborators they killed. Other responsibilities in the Haarlem resistance group included transporting Jewish refugees to a new hiding place, working in the Enschede Emergency Hospital, and blowing up the railway line between Ismuiden and Haarlem. They joined forces with Hannie Schaft in 1943. Hannie was a former university student who dropped out after refusing to sign a German loyalty oath. The three young women banded together to form a sabotage and assassination cell. Hannie had become their best friend, and the sisters were heartbroken when the Nazis arrested and killed her in 1945, just 3 weeks before the war in Europe ended. According to legend, after being wounded by her executioner, Hannie's last words were, "I'm a better shot." The sisters had to deal with the trauma of killing people and losing their best friend after the war. Truce later spoke and wrote about their experiences in the resistance. As she told Vice Netherlands in 2016, Freddy coped by getting married and having babies. But the experience of war still caused her to lose sleep at night. In another interview, Freddy described seeing a person she'd shot fall to the ground and feeling compelled to help him. Truce died in 2016, and Freddy died on September 5, 2018, one day before she turned 93. Throughout their long lives, the Dutch failed to recognize the women's accomplishments and dismissed them as communists. In 2014, they were awarded the Mobilisate Oorlogskreuz, or War Mobilization Cross, in recognition of their service to their country. Before we continue on with our heroes, tell us in the comments who your hero is, and hit subscribe while you're at it. 3. Hans and Sophie Scholl. Two German college students entered one of the main campus buildings at the University of Munich on February 18, 1943, at the height of World War II. They walked to the top of a staircase and threw a stack of leaflets over the railing and into the crowded atrium. The leaflet, the sixth in a series of underground publications from The White Rose, urged fellow students to rise up against Adolf Hitler and the Nazi war machine. The janitor grabbed the students, who tossed the booklets and handed them over to the Gestapo, the Nazi secret police. The two students were siblings by the names of Hans and Sophie Scholl. Within days, Hans and Sophie, as well as their friend Christoph Probst, were charged with treason and executed. Many of their White Rose resistance movement co-conspirators were executed within months of that. Sophie Scholl's name is now synonymous in Germany with bravery, conviction, and the inspiring power of youth. Sophie fought a murderous regime at the age of 21, not with weapons or grenades, but with thoughts and ideals. Sophie was born in 1921 into a Christian family. When Hitler and his National Socialist Party took power, she was 12 years old. Despite her parents' opposition to the Nazi Party, she excitedly took part in Nazi-run youth programs, the Hitler Youth for Boys and the League of German Girls for Girls. Sophie quickly climbed the ranks for her optimism and leadership abilities. However, by the time she graduated, Germany was deep in war, and among those drafted were her boyfriend and two of her brothers. She had shifted from a proud patriotism to a deep sorrow for people who were dying on the front lines. She feared for her friends and family, and despised the fascist police state that sadly controlled their every waking move. Sophie, who was intelligent and ambitious, wished to study biology and philosophy at university, but was forced to spend a year in the National Labor Service, where she despised the military regimen and boring chores. In her journal entries and letters to her boyfriend, there's a young woman yearning for peace and freedom. Sophie enrolled at the University of Munich in 1942, where her older brother Hans was already a student of medicine. Hans and his friends were conscripted as medics on the Eastern Front, where they witnessed crimes such as the mass murder of Polish Jews and the unnecessary deaths of endless German soldiers. In June 1942, they could no longer contain their rage at Hitler's criminal regime, so Hans and a small group of like-minded friends founded the White Rose and started to publish and pass out underground booklets calling on ordinary Germans to oppose Nazism. In one of the booklets, Hans and fellow White Rose member Alexander Schmorl strongly called the mass murder of Polish Jews and German concentration camps the most terrible crime against human dignity, a crime for which there is no comparison in the entire history of mankind. In another booklet, the White Rose encouraged ordinary Germans to commit sabotage wherever they worked, in munitions factories, government offices, newspapers, and universities. Every one of us is capable of contributing something to bringing down this system. Sophie joined her brother in the White Rose resistance and assisted in the publication and distribution of booklets throughout Munich and other German cities, which was difficult given rationing and travel restrictions during the war. Please duplicate and pass on, begged the leaflet, hoping that it would reach more Germans objecting to the regime. Sophie and the other White Rose members believe that the tide of the war had turned against Germany by 1943. Germany lost 500,000 troops during the catastrophic Battle of Stalingrad in late 1942, and the White Rose began taking more daring steps to mobilize a disheartened public. The group spray-painted "Freedom" and "Down with Hitler" graffiti all over Munich. Rather than mailing their booklets in secret, they decided to distribute them on campus in person. One of the last booklets that Sophie and Hans threw into the crowded atrium was authored by one of their professors, Kurt Huber, and ended with this hopeful urging: "Our nation is on the verge of rising up against Europe's enslavement through National Socialism in the new, devout breakthrough of freedom and honor." After Sophie was arrested, she initially denied any involvement with the booklets or the White Rose, but after Hans owned up to his role, she confessed as well. "We were convinced that Germany had lost the war and that every life sacrifice for this lost cause was in vain," Sophie explained to her interrogators. "The sacrifice demanded at Stalingrad in particular moved us to do something in opposition to the senseless shedding of blood. I quickly realized that our conduct was intended to bring the current regime to an end." Sophie and Hans attempted to shield the other White Rose members by stating that they were primarily responsible for writing the booklets, but their friends were eventually pulled into the investigation and died by guillotine. Sophie's final words before being led away to be executed were, "It is such a splendid sunny day, and I have to go." But how many have to die on the battlefield these days? How many young, promising lives? What does my death matter if by our actions thousands are warned and alerted? As it happened, the last booklet was smuggled out of Germany and made its way to the United Kingdom and the United States, where ousted German author Thomas Mann appreciated the White Rose members, saying, "Good, splendid young people, a new faith in freedom and honor is dawning. You shall not have died in vain. You shall not be forgotten." 2. Josephine Baker. As war drums rang across Europe in 1939, the head of France's military spy agency enlisted an unlikely spy, Josephine Baker, France's most famous woman. Jacques Abti invested his time at the beginning of World War II trying to recruit spies to gather intelligence on Nazi Germany and other Axis powers. Usually, the chief of the Secret Service desired men who could travel undercover. When it came to the American-born dancer and singer, nothing was ordinary. Baker, who was born into poverty in St. Louis in 1906, grew up without a father in numerous rat-infested places. She had only a scattered school education and was married by the time she was 13 years old. She left Jim Crow America at the age of 19 to perform as a burlesque dancer in the music halls of Paris after experiencing racism. Her risque dance routines while wearing nothing more than a pearl necklace and a rubber banana skirt made her a jazz-age phenomenon. She rose to become Europe's highest-paid entertainer after venturing out into singing and film acting. Baker's celebrity status made her a doubtful spy candidate because she could never travel discreetly, but that's precisely why she was such an appealing candidate. Her cover could be her fame. Abti wanted Baker's charm, beauty, and stardom to be enough to entice secrets from the lips of adoring diplomats at embassy parties. Baker agreed to spy for her adopted country after discovering the freedom that America promised on parchment in France. "France made me who I am," she explained to Abti. "Parisians gave me their hearts, and I am ready to give them my life." Baker kept going with her nightly performances in Paris in the weeks following the German invasion. She sang to soldiers on the front lines over the radio and consoled refugees in homeless shelters. Early in June 1940, as the invaders drew near Paris, Abti insisted that Baker leave. As a result, Baker packed up her belongings, including a gold piano and a bed once owned by Marie Antoinette, and left for a chateau 300 miles to the southwest. She hid refugees and French resistance members in her new quarters as Nazi troops marched down the Champs-Élysées and occupied her Paris home. She worked with the French resistance network in North Africa and used her connections to safeguard passports for Jews escaping the Nazis in Eastern Europe, until she was hospitalized in June 1941 with peritonitis. During an 18-month hospitalization, she underwent numerous operations and became so ill that the Chicago Defender published her obituary, written by Langston Hughes. He wrote that Baker was as much a victim of Hitler as the troops who fall today in Africa fighting his armies. Josephine was driven away from her beloved Paris by the Aryans. Baker immediately corrected the record. "There has been a slight error. I'm much too busy to die," she said. As Baker recovered, American diplomats and French resistance members gathered at her bedside to continue the spy work. In November 1942, she watched from her balcony as American soldiers came to Morocco as part of Operation Torch. After being discharged, Baker traveled to all the Allied military camps from Algiers to Jerusalem. By day, she drove jeeps across North Africa's scorching deserts. To avoid landmines, she wrapped up and slept on the ground next to her vehicle at night. After a 4-year absence, she returned to Paris following its liberation in October 1944. Baker rode in the back of a car, dressed in her blue Air Auxiliary lieutenant's uniform with gold epaulets, as the crowd on the Champs-Élysées tossed her flowers. She was more than just a glamorous star. She was a national hero. 1. Albina Marley Hoka. Slovenian resistance fighter Albina Marley Hoka served during one of Eastern Europe's darkest periods. Albina was born in Vinica, North Macedonia in September 1925 and was one of 8 children in a working-class family. Sadly, her father became ill and died several years after the family moved to Jerka Vas when she was in 3rd grade. When Germany invaded Yugoslavia in 1941, Albina joined the People's Liberation Movement and fought in the People's Liberation War of Yugoslavia. She was quickly recognized for her skills and abilities, and higher-ranking staff trusted her enough to use her to relay information and act as a liaison. She moved to Česká Vas with her mother following a 3-month stint in Novo Mesto and began serving as a contact point between several cities. Unfortunately, politics and betrayal caused an Axis offensive of liberated territory, and in the middle of 1942, Albina found herself enlisting in the League of Communist Youth of Yugoslavia and serving in the 3rd Battalion, 3rd Company of the 1st Slovenian Brigade. By December of that year, Albina, who was serving as a nurse and battalion secretary at the time, eventually took part in fighting across the country. She suffered several injuries between late 1942 and late 1943, including those that resulted in major deformation of her face and the loss of an eye. Albina was photographed at some point during this period, and the photograph became an iconic image that would continue to resurface in the public's mind for years to come. Albina had been assigned to medical duties by 1945, even working as a flying nurse, a critical position that exposed her to the dangers of both enemy fire and the dangers of aviation technology that was still in its infancy. She was awarded the Yugoslavian Order of the Partisan Star, 3rd class, for her unwavering courage in the face of perilous circumstances. Albina attempted to start a new life after the war, ultimately becoming a notable member of the government. She passed away on January 24, 2001.
Number 7. Runner. Wireless communication was in its earliest stages during World War I, so militaries relied on other means to relay messages back and forth. The most reliable method of sending and receiving correspondence was through human runners. These runners would go back and forth between units delivering updates. It was one of the war's most important and most dangerous jobs. Runners were typically low-ranking officers who were fit and good at reading maps, according to Doran Cart, who works as a senior curator at the National World War I Museum and Memorial in Kansas City, Missouri. Speaking to History.com, he further explained that an ideal runner was resilient enough to handle challenging weather and agile enough to navigate challenging obstacles. These lone messengers were almost constantly at risk of being shot while traveling to neighboring units and back. It wasn't a question of if, but when a runner would be killed or wounded, according to a 1931 Hartford Courant article written by World War I veteran Alan Dexter. Most of their time was spent along the front lines of extensive zigzagging trench networks where traveling even a short distance took a long time. The mud was thick, wet, and difficult to move through. Runners played a crucial role in coordinating plans between units. Because the job was so dangerous, multiple runners were often sent out to relay the same message in case they didn't survive the trip. They took different routes to increase the chances of at least one of them reaching their destination alive. Number 6. Fighter pilot. The famous Wright brothers made the first successful aircraft flight in 1903, just 11 years before World War I broke out. By the time the conflict was in full swing, most of the world was infatuated with aviation. Governments recruited military pilots with propaganda that portrayed the job as glamorous and heroic, and the strategy worked well. But aviation was still in its infancy at the conflict's onset, and it was an incredibly risky gig. Military pilots faced some of the shortest life expectancies among the war's participants, surviving for just 10 weeks on average. Most lost their lives without ever seeing combat, including 8,000 members of the British Royal Flying Corps who died during training. Most fighter planes of the era were simple biplanes with open cockpits and crude instruments. They were made from wood and canvas, making them prone to collapsing and catching fire. Planes were not equipped with radios, and the only way for pilots and gunners to interact was through hand signals. It wasn't uncommon for pilots to get lost while flying, sometimes leaving them with no choice but to land in a field and ask locals for directions or fly low and rely on visual aids. World War I was a critical period for aviation development. It was a learning experience that revealed the major pitfalls of early planes and the importance of prioritizing flight safety. Aircraft technology advanced rapidly throughout the conflict, and while flying remained dangerous for a long time, these improvements made it far less deadly. Number 5. Munitions Net. A well-supplied military is imperative for success in any war. When World War I broke out in 1914, the British government encouraged women to register for war service jobs to keep up with production demands and so that more men could fight. Thousands answered the initial call, and by the war's end, somewhere between 700,000 and 1 million women were working in munitions factories throughout the UK. The hours were long and the conditions were unsafe for these munitionettes. They performed grueling physical labor, operated extremely dangerous machinery, often while exhausted, and were exposed to toxic materials, including asbestos. In addition to being dangerous, the work was often uncomfortable. Factories were extremely loud, ventilation was poor, and the work was repetitive. The environment made it difficult for many to concentrate on their work, and they were required to meet quality standards despite the tediousness of some jobs and the many distractions around them. Each position came with different risks, and some jobs were more hazardous than others. Workers who were tasked with filling shells often suffered from TNT poisoning. Regular contact with the explosive could cause many different health issues, with liver damage ranking as the most serious among them. The condition turned their skin yellow, earning them the nickname of canaries. An estimated 400 munitions workers came down with toxic jaundice, and around 100 of them died. At the time, there were hardly any laws and regulations to protect employees' health and safety. Workplace accidents were common, and munitions factories workers risked their lives to get the job done. It's unclear how many people died during this period because these tragedies were often withheld from the media. But some accidents were too major to hide from the public. In early 1917, a major explosion occurred at a factory in East London, killing 73 workers and injuring around 400. In addition to the unavoidable dangers of working with highly explosive materials, factories were also prime targets for enemy air raids. The women who bravely and selflessly jeopardized their health and safety to manufacture critical supplies for the military are remembered today as some of the war's unsung heroes. Would you do this job if you were a woman alive during World War II? Tell us in the comments and hit subscribe while you're at it. Number 4. Sapper. A sapper is a soldier who performs various engineering tasks. During World War I, this meant digging trenches, building fortifications and railroads, carrying out demolitions, and performing mining operations. Sappers also set, operated, and guarded tripwires and booby traps, often working in underground tunnels in complete darkness to take out enemy troops. Many of them who filled these shoes were miners before the war or had experience digging tunnels and sewers. The need for tunnel specialists who were used to working underground in stuffy, cramped conditions became apparent early on in the war when the Germans began tunneling beneath Allied trenches and setting off explosives. The British military immediately got to work digging their own tunnel systems, which typically consisted of a main shaft with tunnels leading toward the enemy. This type of warfare proved to be a major facet of the conflict, and the demand for sappers only increased. By the middle of 1916, there were around 25,000 British sappers participating in the war. They had to be as quiet as possible while they carried out their work to avoid tipping the enemy off to their presence. Some sappers wore socks over their shoes to soften the sound of their footsteps, and they often wrote messages and instructions to each other on tunnel walls to avoid having to talk out loud. During their time underground, they were in constant danger of having a tunnel collapse or being flooded out by the enemy. Sappers also routinely worked with explosives, which was unavoidably dangerous. Number 3. Trench Raider. Trench warfare is commonly remembered as a defining feature of World War I. During the early days of war, soldiers dug large trenches as a defense against the enemy. Much like a moat surrounding a castle, it was a way to keep the enemy from getting too close. During World War I, trenches took on increased importance as a way for soldiers to avoid machine gun fire and the destruction of other modern weapons. Trenches also may have provided troops with at least some protection from the harmful effects of mustard gas and other airborne agents that were used during the conflict. In a practice known as trench raiding, soldiers crossed through an area between opposing forces known as no man's land and ventured into enemy territory in the middle of the night. They used this as an attack method and as a way to gain valuable information about the opponent's operations. Trench raids were never carried out during the day because it was impossible for troops to enter no man's land without being seen and most likely killed. But it was possible to sneak across at night. The men who carried out these attacks would creep up on the enemy's night guard and kill him as quietly as possible. They then carried out their mission objectives as quickly as possible, ideally spending no more than a few minutes in the trench. In addition to gathering intelligence, trench raiders destroyed equipment and weapons and killed and kidnapped enemy soldiers. Before leaving, they often threw grenades at sleeping troops. A successful trench raid also inflicted psychological damage and damaged morale by leaving the enemy feeling vulnerable and threatened. But there were plenty of things that could go wrong during these missions. To avoid being bogged down by heavy equipment, trench raiders were lightly armed with old-fashioned weapons like clubs, bayonets, knives, hammers, hatchets, and brass knuckles. In an era of mechanized weapons, it was incredibly dangerous to enter enemy territory equipped for little more than medieval-style hand-to-hand combat. And while some trench raiders carried pistols and other small firearms, they avoided using them at all costs because the noise would give away their presence. Even when trench raiders moved silently, there was always a chance that an enemy soldier would wake up and shoot them or raise the alarm to their presence. Things could take a deadly turn on a moment's notice, including after the raid was over. Upon returning, trench raiders were sometimes mistaken by their fellow soldiers as the enemy and killed by friendly fire. Number 2. Tank Driver. The elusive nature of trench warfare led to a lengthy stalemate along the Western Front during World War I. So, the French and British developed the first ever combat tanks, which hit the field for the first time in 1917 during the Battle of the Somme. The idea was to create an armored vehicle that was capable of traversing over shell holes, barbed wire, and other obstacles with ease. Unfortunately, the first tanks were mechanically unreliable and incapable of barreling through trenches and over obstacles like their developers envisioned. One of the first tanks to be used on the battlefield was the British-developed Mark I. It was prone to breaking down, and only 1/3 of the 49 vehicles made it across the trench. The Mark I's failures resulted largely from its rushed design and production. And while the results were disappointing, they did help to influence the development of better tanks. Most World War I tanks were less than impressive metal hulks that moved at no more than a walking pace. Driving these primitive vehicles came with unique risks, including the possibility of getting stuck in the mud or breaking down on enemy territory. One British tank crew became trapped in no man's land for 3 days during the 2-month-long Battle of Passchendaele in 1917. The 9-man crew advanced into the area after 3 weeks of heavy rain and shelling. It wasn't long before they encountered German gunfire and ended up stuck in a muddy ditch with its back end in the area. In the meantime, British troops began retreating to their trenches, leaving the crew stranded by themselves in the tank. The Germans tried to swarm the vehicle with grenades, and the British soldiers fought back fiercely, but were almost all wounded. This continued for 3 days before the tank crew finally escaped at night under the cover of darkness. By then, they were injured and had drunk dirty radiator water just to stay alive. Number 1. Stretcher-bearer. Getting a wounded soldier to treatment as quickly as possible can mean the difference between life and death. Prior to World War I, porters were tasked with retrieving injured men from battlefields and transporting them to medical care. This was done in a relatively unrushed fashion. It wasn't until the Great War that the concept of urgency became a defining factor in the approach to treating wounded troops along the front lines. Stretcher-bearers were the forerunners to modern military medics. Realizing the importance of starting treatment on the battlefield, they made it a priority to begin working on injured soldiers as soon as possible. Working in teams of 4 to 6, they loaded each patient onto a stretcher and carried him to safety. They worked as quickly as possible, but were often slowed down by knee-deep mud and rain while carrying a patient in the line of fire. Unfortunately, many wounded soldiers were stuck waiting for days before stretcher bearers arrived, and some died while awaiting rescue. But these early medics did the best they could in challenging circumstances. And it's precisely this dedication that led to further improvements in battlefield treatment as well as civilian emergency medical care. Thanks for watching. Which one of these jobs sounds the most dangerous to you? Tell us in the comments and remember to subscribe. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time for another amazing video right here on American Eye.